Welcome to Chapter 43. If you've had some psychology, this chapter is going to be a breeze for you. If you haven't, it's a fascinating chapter to look at the relationships not only among species, but between species. We know that communication is critical not only in our world, but in the animal world to be able to get information across to each other, whether it's gathering food, mating, reproduction, even danger. Those are all communicative techniques that are used in the world. And so here's just an example with the honeybees. Lots of different types of communication are involved in the honeybees, not only chemical in the pheromones, but also tactile. They'll touch the bee when it comes back to figure out exactly where the food is at. All of those are part of the natural world. We know our definition of a behavior, any action that can be observed and described. Some behavior is inherited, that's nature. Some is environmental. They're still trying to figure out exactly what is nature and what is nurture. I know when I teach these topics on campus, when you look at some of the videos, you're like, well, it could be this, but it could be that. Generally, if it's an instinctive behavior, we know it's an inherited behavior. It happens automatically, like touching the cheek of a newborn baby. If you touch its cheek, it will turn its mouth thinking it's going to be fed. And if you're really evil, you can touch the other cheek and it will turn its mouth the other way, trying to get to the bottle or the breast. Inheritance influences behavior. We know that some techniques like raising young are instinctive and some aren't. There's a zoo where they had a bunch of primates. I think they were chimpanzees, and the babies were dying and they couldn't figure out why. Well, what they had done is they had separated the females, and the female didn't know how to take care of her baby. Like, if you have a baby all of a sudden and you've never been around babies, you wouldn't know what to do. So they started leaving the females in with the older females so they could watch what they do and learn actually how to raise their young. So not everything is influenced, some of it is actually environmental. Nest building behavior in the lovebirds, we know that they could carry strips of nesting material in their bills. The strips of material are not only tucked in their feathers in some species, but they're carried in their beaks in others. Feeding behaviors in garden snakes, if you offer them certain food, they will not actually eat it depending on what it is, and they've measured the flicks of the tongue and all that kind of stuff, but to tell exactly how they'll eat and what they'll eat based upon the flicking of the tongue. Experiments suggest that behavior is a genetic behavior. We know there are certain things that are genetic and certain things that aren't. If you look at that nurturing behavior in mice, there's actually a single gene they think is actually the nurturing gene, and if they don't have that gene, then they ignore their babies and they die. So that's something they're looking at in humans as well. Do we have this inherited maternal care like the mice? Not all of them have it. What is a fixed action pattern? This came up in class this week, and FAP is something that's going to happen basically exactly the same way every time. There's some kind of sign stimulus that's what's going to trigger that behavior, and that behavior then will happen the same way every time. Now, it could be a learned behavior like pecking. Baby birds don't always know what they're doing as far as going out to look for food, and they'll randomly peck at things, and when they catch an insect, then that strengthens that behavior, so then they continue to peck to look for more food. Here's the pecking behavior. As it gets older, you can see its accuracy was better. Here it's not very accurate, but as it gets older, it's much more accurate. This is a really important one to know if you're going to try to rescue an animal from the wild. Many animals have an imprinting, which is where they form an association between the first moving object they see. We've all seen some of the movies they've made over this, like think Fly Away Home, and there's one about, if you see the guy, I think Lorenz, he's in your book, he actually raised goslings because they imprinted on him. He had to act like the mother, he had to teach him to swim and teach him to do anything. And so when they're raising animals to be released in the wild, they'll have minimal contact with them to avoid the imprinting. There is a sensitive period where this develops, and so like when they're raising condors to release them to the wild, the babies are fed with a puppet, And then as they get bigger, people dress in condor suits to go in and interact with them. That way they're not imprinted on humans. Same thing with red wolves in Glenrose. They keep some of the wolves in the back that have no contact or minimal contact with humans, so they don't imprint on humans and expect humans to take care of them. It's really a critical point because you want to imprint on your own species, not a different species, and hopefully it's apparent. Here's a picture of him. These goslings imprinted on him, and he had to act like the parent. He had to do everything like a parent would in order for them to be able to survive. Social interactions and learning. We know that social interactions even seem to have a stronger influence over the development of any kind of behavior. So the more that type of behavior is around it, the more likely that animal is going to have that behavior. Some birds actually pick up other birds' songs. In the Herd Museum in McKinney years and years ago, I was up there with a class, and there was, I think, a crow that we kept hearing, an owl and a hawk and all these different birds that weren't even there. It had imprinted on the birds that were brought in there to rehab, and it could imitate their songs perfectly. So that's a type of learning that was picked up from the social interactions. Associative learning, this is a change in behavior that involves an association between two events. Like when you have a spray bottle out for a cat, which we know doesn't work. But if you spray the cat when it does a behavior, then it will learn to associate that behavior with a certain event, with your parents or with your children, depending on what stage you're in. You may have done associative learning, trying to get them to see the correlation between the two events to either change or improve the behavior. Some examples of this: classical conditioning. A paired presentation of two different stimulus causes them to form an association. So when Pavlov rang the bell, he gave the dog food, so the dog started to salivate. We do this. Marketing is so good at this. They have the commercials when you hear the music or the jingle or see the pizza, or the hot fudge sundae from Braum. Talk about evil. 10 o'clock at night, they do this seductive commercial showing hot fudge sundaes, and you start to salivate, and where do you go? You go to Braum's. So that's classical conditioning. We're actually being conditioned to purchase the product. In the animal world, this is critical in order for them to be able to survive. They have to know what's safe and what's not safe, and the paired presentation of the two different stimulus will cause them to form an association. We see this among the butterflies and the birds. If a bird eats a monarch first, the monarch is poisonous and it will get sick. So then when it sees a viceroy that looks just like a monarch butterfly, it won't eat it because it has associated being sick with that look of that particular butterfly. They look nearly identical, so it's easy to see how they'd make a mistake. But if the bird eats a viceroy first, then it will try to eat a monarch and get sick. So this is what we call classical conditioning. Paired two different types of stimulus causes you to form an association. And here, of course, is the poor little dog that he did the experiments with. Operant conditioning is a strengthening of the stimulus response connection. And this, of course, is all, we've seen this. This is how they train animals at SeaWorld. They train them at the zoos to do different things. B.F. Skinner did it with the rats. Latent operant conditioning is there's no immediate reward present, but it still does the type of behavior. So we don't see what the reward is, but the behavior is still present. They did this a lot like in SeaWorld, and if you go behind the scenes at any of the zoos in the area, they'll tell you how they train the elephants to, as they come out of the house, they stop in the locked area so that they can present their ears and their feet so they can check them over. And they do this over and over so that when they are ready to do any kind of work on the elephant will respond in a positive way. It will stop just like it always does and gives you a chance to be able to check it out. You do this with your pets. If you have a pet that's averse to getting in the car, you need to do it multiple times to get them used to it. Tried this with one of my dogs. Even went to Sonic to share a hot dog, and he still won't get in the car, but I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep doing it again. And so in order to get him to the vet, I need to do operant conditioning to gradually strengthen the positive experience of getting in the car. But I know the first time he got in my car, he was taken away from where he was because he was a stray, and he was rescued. But he doesn't want to get in the car because I'm sure he thinks I'm going to leave him again. Orientation and migratory behavior are also where environment's going to influence it. The orientation, if you put a bird in a dark room with no windows or lights or anything, it will orient itself in the direction it's supposed to go. And we know that they use stars, they use landmarks, they use all kind of cues, and even the Earth's magnetic field. And this can become a problem because it does shift, and so that will change where they end up at. But the orientation, the ability to go to that particular direction, and then that long distance travel using the environmental cues influences the behavior of the birds and other animals as well. Here you can see how far the starlings migrate just over in Europe. It's a pretty big range. I think it's the egrets that go to Africa. They go a long way in order to do their migration. Another type of behavior is cognitive learning. So we've seen associative learning where we associate two stimulus together. Here's cognitive learning. This is through observation, imitation, and insight. So they're going to see it, they try to do it, and then they solve the problem without using a prior experience. The classic example is the chimpanzee. They hung a banana from the ceiling. The chimp stacked the boxes up to get to the banana. There's a fascinating PBS series right now that does the ravens, where they actually use insight learning to use a stick to open a box to get food inside of it. And they've never done it before. They pull up with the string, they get the stick, they open the box, and they get the food. If you check it out on YouTube, it's really good. Body language of animals can be interpreted to suggest they have feelings. This is one that, don't tell Mr. Dillman, but he always fusses at me because it's called anthropomorphism, where you put human characteristics, emotions onto an animal, but we all know animals do this. If you get a chance to see Animal Odd Couples, we showed some clips from it in class. Animals feel fear, joy, embarrassment, jealousy, love, anger, sadness. All of those are characteristics of animal traits, animal emotions. I was reading an article on how to show your dog you love them, and one of the things was to look into their eyes. And we were talking about how some dogs don't want eye contact, so there must be some kind of emotional thing there. But I have a dog that he will stare in your eyes for as long as you let him, because that must be the way that he shows love. So this type of emotions, we used to think of animals as dumb animals. You've heard that before, but they're actually very, very clever, and really we should be listening to more about what they have to tell us. You see the responses, of course, always the tearful ones where the people come home from overseas and their dogs, recognize them. Or if you're on Pinterest, you've seen pictures of the dogs laying at the computer after the person's gone because they've talked to him over the computer. So those are all things that we're looking at to see, is that really what's going on? And we really honestly think it is. Science is showing us day by day that there are a lot of emotions that we see among animals. Animal communication, we know that society's got to be able to communicate as well as with mating. So you've got to be able to communicate in order to find a mate and then raise the offspring. But also members of the same society have to be able to communicate. It may seem cruel with dominance hierarchy, having the alphas that keep the others in line, but if you don't have that, then your society falls apart. And we see that as well. If there's not rules, then it's total chaos in the human population. So some things are necessary, and we see this in the animal world as well. So what is communication? It's an action by a sender that influences the behavior of a receiver. It may be purposeful, but it does not have to be. The communication can just be sent out there like just a dog howling in the night, or it can actually be communicating fear or sadness, or in the case of 101 Dalmatians, letting them know that the puppies were stolen. Those are things that we see with communication. And we know there's 4 different types. Chemical communication is one. Pheromones are those chemical signals. They can go through water, they can go through air, all of the different transmissions that they have, they're just not traveled through the blood, and they go from one animal to another. This is when every dog for 50 miles is attracted because your dog's in heat. Or this is when if you're dating someone or married to someone and you pick up their t-shirt and you smell it, that rush that you get is due to their pheromones. And perfumes are just basically animal pheromones. They use those perfumes in order to be able to communicate attraction or some kind of behavior. In class yesterday, somebody brought up about ants following a trail. That's chemical communication because that's how they know where to go. They follow the trail, and on the movie, I think it's Bug's Life, a leaf drops in the trail and they freak out, and so they walk them around the leaf. That's because they've lost the trail. So typically, if you can disrupt that trail, the ants will go a different direction. And so there's an example of pheromones. The cat rubbing on you also is an example of pheromones too, marking the territory. There's a really cool old movie called Never Cry Wolf. If you can get your hands on it and watch it, I doubt if it's on YouTube, but you can look. It's really neat, and it goes into talking about the wolf population and the caribou and the humans, the relationship. And of course, they drop this guy in the middle of nowhere to prove that the wolves are taking out the caribou herd, when we know it's obviously not true. It's the humans that are killing them off. And so it's all the stuff he goes through, but he acts like a wolf and he eats like a wolf. He even lives off mice and rats to show that that's what, that an animal that big could live off of it. Another type of communication is auditory communication. Auditory communication uses sound. It's faster, and you can use it at day, at night. It can be modified. We know the different sounds there that are produced are auditory sounds. So we know sounds of fear, we know sounds of happiness, joy, and then we know just the annoying barking dog all night sound. We have a cricket in the house that's driving me crazy at bedtime right now. We have owlets in our garage, which is really cool, and it does this really grating sound to tell us to like get lost. And the parents will sit out there and chatter at us too if we're outside when they're around. So auditory communication is very, very effective. And here you can see the auditory communication of the animals. So the frequency, if it's an eagle, more like look up, versus the frequency of a leopard, like move now. You can see that it's a quicker response for warning the predators, warning its members that the predators are around. Visual communication allows animals to signal others without chemical or auditory messages. So we can, the dog will get down on all fours and drop its belly to the ground to show it's subservient, or it will stand up and put the hair up on the back of its neck and it's telling you, don't pet me. By contrast, we see the different types of behavior that are used a lot. Fireflies, the flash pattern is a signal. There's a female firefly that imitates the flash pattern of a different species of firefly. So when the males show up to mate with her, she eats them. That's going to suck. But that visual signal is used to communicate, either in the case of fireflies attracting a mate, or in the case of a society dominance. You'll see that if you have a dog pack, like I do, you have a dominant one, and the dominant one doesn't have to be the biggest one, but the others will drop to their belly, or they'll lay on their back and show their belly to show they're subservient. That way the dominant one doesn't jump on them. Sometimes they do anyway, but the idea is that it's not going to attack them because it's showing it's subservient using its behavior. So here's the different firefly communication, showing the different patterns among the different species. And then here's a visual display. Of course, the little one doesn't look very impressed, but he's showing his teeth to show that I got these big old teeth and I can hurt you. And that's the visual display that we see. And we know mating is another visual display, especially in the bird population. If you Google bird of paradise mating dance, it's crazy what those birds do to get the females to come into them. Our third one is tactile communication. So we had chemical with the pheromones. We have auditory, I guess this is our fourth. We had auditory with sound. We had visual communication, and that can be mating. Any of these can be mating, they can be food, they can be danger. All of them can be communicated together. Tactile communication is touch. Touch is critical. We just don't really give touch enough credit on how important it is in not only our own development, but also animals as well. There's a lot of tactile communication that goes on. They did a study in Russia, a long time ago, in an orphanage. They had two groups of babies. One group they put in beds, they didn't touch them, they didn't hug them, they didn't do anything, just minimal, fed them, changed them, laid them down. The other group, they brought in a group of mentally challenged young women, and they played with the babies, and they rocked the babies, and they talked to the babies. The ones in the bed, some of them died. Some of the babies died because touch is so critical. And then the ones that were played with and loved and touched, those went on to actually be very successful adults. So touch is important. They know now that in adoption, sometimes they have a touch disconnection between the babies, that when they grow up, they never get that intimacy, that touch, that connection between their parents because they weren't touched as a baby. So it's critical to make sure that if you do have children, that you take your time. But if you do have children, that you play with them, you touch them, you love them. That's all a very, very important part of their normal development. Now here, this bee has come back and told them where the food is, and it's called a waggle and a round dance. And based upon its direction, it tells the others where the food is. And above here, you can see the way that it's turning and dancing in the direction of the food. Behavioral ecology study how natural selection shapes behavior. Certain behaviors lead to survival and then reproduction. So we know that it changes, and that increases the fitness of the individual. One type of behavior that we see that increases fitness is territoriality. If you look at hawks when you're driving down the road, they each are multiple telephone poles apart, and that's because they each have set their own territory. I actually saw one over on another pole with two hawks together on a pole, and I decided they were just visiting because normally they're not together. Normally they have their own set territory, and if you know your territory, if you know your space, then the population gets along. It's just like living with a brother or sister or roommate. If you don't have your own space, then when the other one comes into your space, then it causes issues. So territoriality most often comes into play during reproduction. So in reproduction, you want to have a space for the babies to develop and be protected, and that's where you kind of mark off your territory. And you can mark it through chemical, you can mark it through physical, you can mark it through any number of ways to say, hey, this is my territory. Even visual, by the behavior that you do in visual. Here you can see just the spacing for everybody marking their own individual territory. Foraging for food. Foraging for food is important. Having that behavior that allows you to forage for food so that it will survive is the key. So modeling your behavior after the others, but also figuring out how to get food on your own, that's part of it there. Of course, raccoons are really good at this. They can get into just about anything and do it. My cat's pretty good at getting into stuff and being able to eat it. So that kind of foraging behavior is important for them to be able to get food. As we've mentioned, there's a couple of behaviors that are going to increase fitness. There are several different conditions. We have polygamous, polyandrous, and monogamous. Now, most of us are familiar with monogamous. This is the kind of relationship that hopefully you're striving for, where one male and one female get together, they both help raise the young, they spend their life together, or in some cases it's that season. It's not necessarily their entire life. Unless you're like a Canadian goose, they do mate for life. But monogamous has one male and one female together, working together to raise the young. Right now I've got owls in my garage that are doing this. There's a male and a female and the offspring. Polyandrous, the way I remember this one is there's poly means many, androus means Andes, guys. So many guys, so more than one male, the female's mating with more than one male. There's a bird that does this. I think it's the blue-footed booby. She mates with one male and puts an egg in its nest. She mates with the next one, puts an egg in its nest, and so on. And so she's got the ideal thing. She mates with them, doesn't have to raise the kids. They actually raise the young. And so she's going to mate with more than one male. Polygamous is the one like in the lion pride. The male in its harem, he has multiple females and one single male. The females put more energy in it though, because the females are the ones that hunt, that raise the young, and the males pretty much just there for mating. And so it's a different kind of dynamic in the relationship. And here we see the baboons as far as the multiple females with the one male. There's the one male, and the lighter ones, or the darker ones, are the females. Sexual selection is important. It's really important to actually be choosy. You want to pick the best male, the best mate that's going to give you the traits that make your young successful. And so they mentioned down there with the peahens, the Peacocks, the big huge feathers, those are the males, and the females choose the most brilliant, the most beautifully colored ones as the male. That's how they determine which male they're going to go with. If you want to see crazy one I mentioned earlier, the Bird of Paradise, he does some crazy stuff to attract the female, but it's the one that does it the best is the one that's going to get the female. And the big tail could be detrimental, though. You could be the one that gets eaten, but you can also be the one that attracts the female. And this is an adaptive change. This is natural selection where they're choosing the best one to mate with, not just picking the first one that comes along. And in the spider world, I think we talked about that before, she mates with a spider. She can wait a couple of days to fertilize her eggs just in case something better comes along. Courtship is a whole thing, and we've been talking in class about the spiders. The male spider wraps up an insect and gives it to the female, presents her with the gift, and then if she likes it, she'll eat it while he mates with her. And if she gets done, you know, I guess she eats him sometimes, but he actually brings her gifts. Sometimes it's garbage, but sometimes it's insects. The bowerbird's going to build a nest, the right nest. Even the lamprey does this. We mentioned before that it scoops out a nest. It puts the perfect rock near the mouth. If she likes the rock, she'll attach to it, and then they reproduce. Sometimes there's some display behaviors. Other times there are color changes, like in the octopus and the cuttlefish. The male will change colors to attract the female or to warn other males to stay away from her. And then here's the responsiveness, the rate of starting the females versus the courtship success here. And then here you have the two males that are competing together to get the attention of the female. Now, living in a society, there are benefits and there are costs. The benefits is you can avoid predators easier, your safety in numbers. You can help get your kids raised or raise kids, and you can get food more easy. But you can get disputes over feeding and sleeping sites and things like that. You may not always be at the top of the pack when it comes to living in a society. But the benefits do typically outweigh the cost, otherwise the organisms wouldn't do it. And then the hierarchy is a good thing. You have your alpha male and female, and then the subordinates will be underneath. They are at a disadvantage, but think about it. If something happens to the alpha, you could move up into that position. And typically they're genetically related, so it's to your benefit anyway. Altruism is self-serving behavior. We see this with the meerkats. One of the meerkats stands up at attention, watching for predators, and if a predator comes along, it actually puts themselves at risk, whereas the others are feeding and then they take turns to do that. And we see this in insect society. Some insects never get to reproduce because they're drones or slaves, and so they only the queen is the one that reproduces, but they get food, they get shelter, and so they're sacrificing themselves for the good of the group. Inclusive fitness includes reproduction success of yourself as well as your relatives. Genetic relatedness may actually play part of that. And then in reciprocal altruism, you actually have others that are helping, and they're getting a benefit as well. So both are mutually dependent. So here's the queen ant, you know, mating with the drone. She lays the eggs, they carry them off and tend to them, and they don't actually reproduce, but the eggs are typically related to the offspring as well. And here's a brother watching over a sibling and keeping guard. And so see how he's upright? He actually puts himself at risk while the little one's being guarded on it. So that's the inclusive fitness of altruism. And that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed chapter 43.